everyone, it's Melissa with Anita Good Design, and today we're going to take a deeper dive into a collection that we call Botanical Aviary Quilt. Now this beautiful quilting collection features a few techniques that we love here at Anita Good Design, including our quilting technique, some folded fabric borders, and we even have embroidery stitching over the borders in this. But today the thing I really wanted to show you all is our fussy cutting technique for the background fabric. So this beautiful bird collection that we have coming out in the quilt will show the birds featured on these quilt blocks coming over their borders. Now the fussy cutting technique is where we take a special section of the fabric that we chose and use that as part of the block's design. Now in order to fussy cut, you do need a certain type of fabric. What we're looking for is something with a larger print, definitely nothing super ditzy or tiny, because then it loses the effect of the point of fussy cutting. So specifically speaking, fussy cutting, the term, is to be particular or fussy about the section that we're going to choose in the material. Now I gathered the stuff that I'll need to stitch out this block with everyone. We have our base fabric of choice. We did this nice big print that I'll lay out for you and show off. And we also have two different colors for our border fabrics. So I went ahead and pre-cut those items so that we have them ready to go. We have two borders of each color that you saw in the stitch out. And I also have a piece of quilt batting at hand. Now I don't have my cutting mat over here, but I do have my rotary cutter and ruler and all the essentials that you would need. And so to do the fussy cutting, we'll take a look at that. And I'll go ahead and unfold this fabric so you all can see exactly what we're working with. Now the type of fabric or brand is not super particular. You might not be able to find the same fabric that we have featured here, but this one was by Moda, I believe modafabric.com is where we found it, but a beautiful tropical and very vibrant print. Now I went ahead and snuck in the cut that I already took here so you all can see exactly what section we took out of the print, but this would be basically the fussy cut section that we chose. So if I show you my bird overlaid on the fabric, you can see that we wanted to feature in the white space this little guy right here. Now the beautiful part about this collection is that each of the birds are stitched sitting within the block so that there is that negative space within the design, and that allows you to play with your base material. So for the block we're stitching today, I went ahead and pre-cut it. Now if we're doing an A-size quilt block, you would only need about a 9 by 9 inch cut of fabric, but obviously I cut it a little bit larger to ensure I got the section that we wanted. So we're going to go ahead and set up the machine and we'll get started. Alright, now that we have our machine set up and everything is loaded to our hoop, we have our hoop set up with some no-show mesh stabilizer for quilt blocks. And I have it ready to go with a dark thread so that everyone will be able to see kind of what we're stitching. But be sure to remember to match your fabric colors as you go throughout the project for the best finished results. So to start off the design, we are going to stitch the first step, which is what we call our squaring stitch. And this is essentially to square off the place of where we're going to put our batting for our block. Now at Anita, we always put the batting into the design rather than the traditional quilting method of doing it at the end. That way you don't have to worry about putting the batting into the finished quilt and all your layers are already together. And it also saves some extra waste by doing it that way. And for those curious, I am stitching the A-size quilt block. So we have our placement stitch stitched out, and I have my batting pre-cut just over 8 inches or so. You can go as high as 9 if you're doing the A-size block. And we're going to lay it directly in the hoop and make sure we cover the stitches on all sides. From there, I'm going to go ahead and run the second machine step, which is the tacking stitch for that batting. Now as a friendly reminder, all of our placement stitches are single ply, and all of our tacking stitches are 2 ply, so that it will go around 2 times to ensure that your material is secured, or in this case our batting. So I'm just guiding it a bit with my hand, but if you are not one to like to put your hand in the machine, you do not have to. All right, and once our batting has been tacked down, we're gonna go ahead and wait for it to cut the thread. And now I'm going to pull the hoop out of the machine and use scissors to trim away any of that excess batting from that tacking stitch line. Now, best practice is to lay your hoop flat, so if you can't see my hoop, just know that you gotta lay it on a flat surface to cut. And my favorite scissors I highly recommend, and everyone at Anita is using them, is our double curved tip embroidery scissors. For all appliques and trimming, I find that these give the best cut, and you'll see us use them in pretty much every video. And a lot of times at events, I used to get asked, well, why do we trim away this excess batting? It is so that we don't have humps in the finished quilt when we put our blocks together. So we don't want that excess batting in the seam allowance. So now that I have trimmed it away, I have a nice clean square block of batting, and I'm gonna slide that back into the machine. Now, the next step, since we are doing a block with borders, is that this will have a placement stitch for the base fabric. Now, traditionally with quilt blocks, if the fabric goes all the way over the block, it will extend to the edges, and you will not need a placement stitch. We would just lay it right after the batting. But in this case, since we're going to have borders, there is a placement stitch showing us the center area of our block. So I'm gonna go ahead and run that placement stitch. And now we have a placement to kind of square off where we want to put our fussy cut fabric. So if you remember from earlier, we fussy cut a large square of this material, and we wanted to feature that little bird in the corner. Now I already ran the block before, so I do have a visual reference that I can kind of look at and see where the bird sits. But just remember, if you're doing this for the first time, you choose where you want the fabric to go. So I could pick a flower to go in that absent space, or the bird, or different leaves. In this case, we definitely wanted that cute little bird to sit in the corner. And the biggest thing with fussy cutting is ensuring you have enough fabric to cover that whole placement stitch. So as long as your inner placement stitch is covered up, you will be good to go. And I'm going to pull them down just a little bit more and ensure I have it covered on all sides. So I think that looks pretty good. If you're happy with the positioning of everything, you can go ahead and run that tacking stitch. Now again, I would suggest matching, so since my fabric is mostly white, I would normally do this with a white thread, but just so everyone can see the stitch lines, we're going to go ahead and run it in a nice dark teal. Doesn't matter if you forget, because the borders will cover up this tacking stitch anyway. So once again, reminder that it'll be a 2-ply tacking stitch running around the square. Alright, so our tacking stitches ran. We've secured our fussy cut fabric to the base of our block, which is now the background. And I want to note again that I did cut this fabric larger than necessary for the block. That way everyone could see what section we chose to fussy cut or particularly cut out that we wanted to feature. But now that it is tacked down, we can take our curved tip applique or embroidery scissors and trim tight to that tacking stitch line. So we're going to get rid of all the excess fabric that we don't need. And if you're fabric conscious, obviously you can measure and pre-cut and plan before you lay it down so that you're not wasting any. But we're just showing you the technique, so it's all right for us. I'm sure you guys love my squeaky scissors. All right, so once our base fabric has been trimmed away, I'll return the hoop to the machine, and if you can see the shot here of our block, you will see some of that batting exposed. That is what we're about to cover up with those borders. So I'll return the hoop, and I'm going to go ahead and run the stippling next, which because we have a quilt block, there is stippling. So we're going to run that and then jump ahead to that step being finished, since it will take a few minutes. But again, I'm going to be using a white thread to make sure I kind of match that background fabric. So we'll thread it up and we'll hit go on the stippling, and when that's finished, we'll meet back. All right, so we finished up our quilt stippling on our background fabric, so now we're gonna go ahead and proceed to run the steps for our folded fabric borders. Now, anytime we do folded fabric at Anita, it's done in a 3-step process where we run a placement stitch, we then run a folding stitch that you'll fold the fabric over, and then a tack down stitch to secure it in place. Now we're going to follow those same 3 steps for each of the folded fabrics in this block, and I'm going to go ahead and swap to a bit of a darker thread just so everyone can kind of see that placement stitch once I've run it. And the first border that my block is stitching, if you're following along and stitching the same one as me, it's going to do that top border first. So we'll go ahead and run the placement. And for our top borders, I did pre-cut that material already. And so I'm going to go ahead and use the green colored stripes first. And now we used a fun fabric in the center, so I don't want everyone to shy away from fun materials in their borders too. We didn't go with a complete solid, so if you happen to see the fabric as I'm placing it and as I'm working with it in the hoop, it has almost a grunged wash look to it, which is really fun and kind of breaks up the solid color a bit to give you something interesting to look at. I'm sliding my hoop out just a bit so everyone can kind of see where my placement is for this fabric, but what we're going to do is our placement stitch box is at the top of our block. I'm going to take my first border fabric and I'm going to lay it right side facing down over the machine's hoop. And we are going to align the raw edge of the fabric to the raw edge of the base material right below it. So if I fold back an edge, you can kind of see there that we're meeting the base fabric and basically pulling our strip about halfway into the placement stitch box. I like to say halfway is a good rule of thumb, but our tutorials tend to say 1/4 inch in from the edge or so. But basically just line it up with the base material and you should be good. So once I have that position, I will slide it back into the machine and we are going to run the folding stitch. Now again, we digitized it this way so that you don't have to worry about traditional paper piecing or any other folded fabric methods. This will keep it nice and clean and create consistent borders throughout all of your quilt blocks. Once you've run the folding stitch, you've now given something for the fabric to hug nice and tight against and create that clean, crisp fold. So again, I'll slide my hoop out a bit, so if you're looking at the hoop from in the machine, you can see. And we are just going to fold that material over the line. So nice and neat. I actually am going to take a piece of tape. Good practice for my new people. If you are new at quilt blocks or folded fabric and you don't like your hands in the machine, just take a nice piece of tape, secure it in place. And at Anita, we love to say to give the fold a good finger crease. So that just means running a little bit of friction with your finger across the fold line, and that'll help keep the fabric nice and taut. Again, if you are matching threads to your fabric, you will need a swap. So I got a nice green color here. Get that in my machine. And then we're going to run our tacking stitch to secure that border. And now that we have finished our top border, I can go ahead and remove that piece of tape that I had holding it down. And we have our first completed folded fabric border. So if you made it this far, good job. And we are going to go ahead and repeat the exact same process on the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and do the bottom border real quick, and then we'll meet up at that point. Alright, so we have finished both our top and bottom borders, and it should look similar to this. Now the difference with this collection than other folded fabric border designs is that there is some embroidery that will run in between the borders. So the next piece of the design that is going to stitch out is actually going to be a branch that's coming out from the right side. The reason being is that our borders are going to end up covering some elements while others are stitched on top. So we're going to go ahead and skip ahead to that part. Alright, so we're jumping back into stitching out our block. I went ahead and did our top and bottom borders, and we went ahead and ran that branch that is going to stick out from the left and right side. So again, I mentioned how this collection is a little different with the embroidery going over the borders. There are some elements that stitch in between. So we have this branch that's going to end up getting covered by our folded fabric. And the next step that my machine is reading is going to be a placement stitch on what I'm looking at the right side of the design for the next border. But there is a very important key element we must do first. So since we have top and bottom borders and we're going to be adding a left and right, I'm going to want to take my trusty embroidery scissors, and we are going to cut away these tabs of fabric that you see sticking out on the edges. The reason we do this is when your machine goes to run that placement stitch, if you leave this floppy piece of fabric hanging out, it can catch on your machine's foot and rip out the whole project, which we definitely don't want. So I'm going to lay my hoop on a flat surface and go ahead and just trim to that tacking stitch line. And just remember to leave your 1/2 inch seam allowance extending at the top and the bottom. So we do need enough to have borders on the edges, but where we're adding our next set of borders, we can trim it away. And I'll be sure to show you all that once I'm done. Get rid of our scraps. And so now, with the block oriented correctly, we have our 2 borders trimmed, and we can go ahead and proceed to the next placement stitch, which will be, like I said, our right side border. So I'm sliding my hoop back in, and we'll proceed to run that step. Now, just like we did before with the placement stitch for the top and bottom border, I went ahead and pre-cut my borders. A good rule of thumb for Anita is 2.5 inches wide by the size of the quilt block that you're stitching. So we did about 9 inches for a 7.7 quilt block, so just a little bit over so that we have an excess. And I'm going to lay my hoop flat. Best way to turn it so that everyone can see. And again, we'll make sure that the wrong side is facing up, so pretty side facing down. And we'll align it to that base fabric that we can see in the block. So again, I align the raw edges, I make sure I lay it nice and flat, and that I have enough seam allowance on the top and the bottom for a 1/2 inch. And then we'll slide our hoop back in and run the folding stitch. And now that we have our folding stitch, once again, we'll fold our fabric nice and taut over the line. Give that fold a good finger crease. I'll pull it out of the machine a bit so everyone can kind of see what we're working with. And now you can kind of see the blue versus the teal borders and how it plays in with the fabric colors that we chose. So once I have my fabric folded over, I'm going to skip using the tape because I'm pretty comfortable with my hands near the machine, but if you need it, definitely use the embroidery tape. So I'm just going to keep an eye on it, make sure everything stays nice and folded, and run that tacking stitch step. Alright, so we went ahead and we stitched out our right side border if we're looking at it in the hoop, and we have some more embroidery to run before we continue the last remaining border piece. So I recommend, depending which block you're stitching, to follow along with your machine steps for that chosen design. Run the decorative embroidery until we reach the placement stitch for our last border piece. So I'm going to go ahead and run the decorative embroidery with the bird design, and we'll meet back at the last border piece to run. Alright, now that we have finished the embroidery for our beautiful bird on our block, You can see where he comes out over the borders, and that branch we stitched before the side borders, how it kind of tucks underneath. So now we're at the stage where we have the last piece of the block to finish, which is going to be our border. So I'm going to go ahead and stick the hoop back in and run the placement stitch for that side piece. And again, I have my fabric strip pre-cut here, ready to go. And then once we've run our placement stitch, I'll pull that hoop out again just so everyone can kind of get a good vantage point of what we're doing. And it's the same as we've done with the other borders, and it will repeat the same process as this opposing teal border. So again, we'll line it up, make sure we have about a 1/2 inch at the top and the bottom, and we're aligning it to that tack down base fabric edge that you see there. So once I have my material positioned in place, I'll return the hoop and run our folding stitch for the folded fabric border. And I'm not sure if I mentioned this before earlier, but our folding stitches are 2-ply. So you'll see it start in the middle, go to each end, and then meet back in the middle. Once it's run the folding stitch, we're going to go ahead and take that piece of fabric and pull it nice and taut over the line and give that fold a good finger crease for the last time. And again, make sure before you run the final tacking stitch on any of your borders that your thread does match, which I have a match in here. And we'll go ahead and run that last step, and then we'll meet you when it's ready to trim out the block. All right, so we went ahead and finished up our block. We have all 4 of our borders in place, and our beautiful aviary bird is stitched out onto our quilt block. So now that we finished the design, the machine steps have been finished off, we're gonna go ahead and unhoop the quilt block from the hoop. And we can set our hoop aside. And the best rule of thumb at Anita is to trim your quilt blocks to a 1/2 inch seam allowance on all 4 sides. So we got our handy dandy rotary cutter and ruler. We're gonna go ahead and give this a quick trim, and then we'll show you the finished block at the end. Okay. And there you have it. This beautiful block is finished from our aviary botanical quilt, and I hope you guys enjoyed stitching it along with me. And definitely check out our other videos for more resources on how to do folded fabric or even how to piece your quilt together. I hope you enjoyed stitching, and happy sewing!